Chain length is another important parameter that we can use to compare different kinds of polymers. And there's various descriptors that have been developed that can allow us to quantitatively compare the chain lengths of different polymers. The problem that we have when we're talking about polymer chain lengths is that a sample contains polymer chains that have many different lengths. It's very rare that they will all have exactly the same length. So we can only talk about this quantity in a statistical sense or in terms of averages. Because if you think about, a mole is 10 to the 23rd, that's over a billion molecules. They're all going to have some distribution of chain lengths. So there's averages that are used to provide a number that's representative of the characteristic length of the chains in a particular sample. And one parameter that's used to do that very widely is called the molecular weight. So the molecular weight expresses the total molar mass of the polymer chain. And it has units of grams per mole or Daltons, which again is equivalent. And apologies to the chemists in the audience. When we use molecular weight, we're really talking about molar mass. And in fact, some books use the term molar mass instead of molecular weight. But we're going to use these terms interchangeably for the purposes of this course. Okay, so let's look at an example to give us an idea of what we mean by molecular weight. And we can talk about a simple polymer, polyethylene, which has a monomer unit that has 2 carbons. And 2 hydrogen groups on each of the carbons. So 2 carbons and 4 hydrogens. So the molecular weight of this monomer we can get by adding up the grams per mole, the molar mass, of each of these constituents. So we have 4 hydrogen atoms, and the molar mass of hydrogen is 1 gram per mole. So this is the molar mass associated with hydrogen, plus 2 carbon atoms times the molar mass of a carbon atom, which is 12 grams per mole. So this gives us then a molecular weight or molar mass of the monomer unit of 28 grams per mole for polyethylene. Now to get the polymer molecular weight, we multiply the monomer or the repeat unit molecular weight times the degree of polymerization. So remember, the degree of polymerization, N, represents the number of repeat units in the polymer chain. If our repeat unit is this element where we have 2 carbons and 4 hydrogens, then imagine that we have a degree of polymerization of 1,000. Then the molecular weight would be 1,000 times the molecular weight of the monomer unit, which is 28 grams per mole. So the molecular weight of the polymer would then be 28,000 grams per mole. Now, this is kind of a simplified description. It leaves out some details. Real polymers have this array of repeat units that we've talked about before, but there's also some other chemical groups that would be attached. There's a terminating group. In this case, it would probably be a hydrogen at the end of the last carbon, and possibly a chemical group at the beginning of the chain that corresponds to an initiator, which is a chemical compound that's used to start the polymerization reaction. We'll talk about more about those factors when we discuss polymerization reactions, but basically these additional components are ignored because they're usually small, usually less than 100 grams per mole for these chemical groups. So out of the total molecular weight of a polymer chain, it's a very small fraction of the total amount, so these can be neglected, but they are there in practice. The final point that I want to make about molecular weight is that a sample is going to have a distribution of chains with different molecular weights. A monodispersed sample is a special case where all the chains have exactly the same length. That actually can be achieved in some very specialized reactions, and we'll talk about those a little bit later in the course, but those are special cases that are not typical. It's more common that we're going to have a range of polymer chain lengths or molecular weights in our sample. And so if we look at this sample, the different chains of different molecular weights and the fraction or the number of chains as a fraction of the total number of chains, we're going to have a distribution function like this. So the challenge for us then becomes, how do we quantify a characteristic chain length that's representative of this distribution, or how do we get some kind of an average quantity that represents this distribution so that we can compare quantitatively different samples. So that's a topic that we're going to talk about in the next video.